Rain poured across the streets of Boston as people hurried home from work. Inside a small neighborhood diner called Miller's Diner, the evening crowd was beginning to disappear. In a corner booth sat Richard Hawthorne. Most people knew him as a billionaire real estate developer. He had built a business empire worth billions of dollars. But tonight, Richard looked defeated. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were tired, and the coffee in front of him had gone cold. His company was collapsing. The media called him a fraud. His board wanted him removed. Banks were threatening to take his assets. And his trusted chief financial officer, Daniel Cross, had disappeared. Richard sat alone, staring at the rain. Then a young waitress approached. "Sir, I think you need this." She handed him a clean handkerchief. Richard looked up. "What?" "The handkerchief," she said gently. He realized his eyes were wet and quickly looked away. "You don't know anything about me." "No, sir," she replied. "I don't." "Then why are you talking like you do?" The waitress picked up his cold coffee. "Because I know what it looks like when someone is carrying too much pain." A few moments later she returned with a fresh cup. Steam rose from the mug. "What's your name?" Richard asked. "Emma Brooks." Richard nodded. "Emma, there are some things people never recover from." Emma smiled softly. "My father died when I was 12. My mother passed away when I was 16. I work here during the day and attend college at night." She looked him in the eye. "So trust me when I say life can get very hard." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued outside. Finally, Emma said, "Whatever happened, Mr. Hawthorne, don't decide your future tonight." Richard stared at the coffee. For the first time all day, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe his story wasn't over. Maybe tomorrow was worth seeing. Welcome to Super Stories. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. USA, Canada, UK, Australia, or anywhere else in the world. Richard couldn't explain why he stayed. Normally, he would have ignored a conversation like this and left. But something about Emma's calm confidence made him remain seated. He took a sip of the coffee. It was hot. For the first time that day, he noticed something other than his problems. "You said life gets hard," Richard said. "You have no idea how bad this is." Emma pulled out the chair across from him. "Then tell me." Richard laughed bitterly. "You really think you can help?" "No," Emma replied honestly. "But sometimes talking helps." For a moment, Richard hesitated. Then the words started coming. He told her about the scandal, about the missing money, about the banks, about the board of directors preparing to remove him, and finally about Daniel Cross, the friend he had trusted for 20 years, the man who handled the company's finances, the man who disappeared just as everything fell apart. When Richard finished, Emma sat quietly. She didn't rush to speak. She simply thought about what he had said. Then she asked one question. "Did you do it?" Richard looked at her. "What?" "The things they're accusing you of." "No." "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure." Emma nodded. "Then why are you acting like you've already been found guilty?" The question hit Richard harder than he expected, because that was exactly what he had been doing. Everyone around him had already assumed the worst. The media, the banks, the board, even some of his friends. And slowly, he had started believing it too. Emma stood up and picked up her coffee pot. People lie. People steal. People betray. But the truth doesn't disappear just because it's taking longer to show up. Richard looked at her. "What if I never find it?" Emma smiled. "Then start looking tomorrow." For the first time in weeks, Richard laughed. It wasn't much, but it was real. As he left the diner that night, the rain had finally stopped. And for the first time since the scandal began, Richard wasn't thinking about giving up. He was thinking about finding the truth. The next morning, Richard went straight to the office of his attorney, Grace Sullivan. Grace had worked with him for more than 10 years. When Richard walked in, she immediately noticed something different. "You actually slept last night," she said. "A little. That's an improvement." Richard sat down and placed a folder on her desk. "I want every document connected to this case." Grace frowned. "You've already seen the reports." "Not the reports. The actual documents." For the next several hours, they reviewed records, emails, contracts, and approval forms. Richard read every page carefully. Around noon, he suddenly stopped. Wait. Grace looked up. What is it? Richard pointed to a transfer authorization. This was approved on March 18th. Yes, I couldn't have signed this. Grace frowned. Why not? Because I was at the hospital that day. Grace quickly checked his calendar. A few minutes later, she found the appointment records. Richard was right. He had been undergoing medical tests at the exact time the document was supposedly signed. The room went silent. Grace looked at him. If this is true, someone used your authorization. Richard immediately thought about Daniel Cross. For the first time, the accusations against him didn't look like mistakes. They looked planned, carefully planned. Grace closed the file. This changes everything. Richard nodded. For weeks he had been defending himself. Now he had something even more important, a lead. And if one document was fake, there could be many more. The search for the truth had officially begun. Later that evening, Richard returned to Miller's Diner. Emma was serving customers when she spotted him walking through the door. A small smile appeared on her face. You came back. You seem surprised. I wasn't sure you would. Richard sat in the same corner booth. Emma brought him a fresh cup of coffee. So, she asked, so you were right. Emma raised an eyebrow. That's a rare sentence for successful people. Richard laughed. My lawyer and I found a document that couldn't have been signed by me. Emma sat across from him for a moment. Meaning someone may have been using my name. That's good. Richard looked confused. How is that good? Because now you know where to start looking. Richard nodded. He explained everything they had discovered. The hospital records. The suspicious approvals. The missing CFO. Emma listened carefully. Then she asked another unexpected question. Who have you talked to? My lawyer. The board. The auditors. Emma shook her head. No, the other people. What other people? The people nobody notices. Richard frowned. Emma pointed toward the kitchen. The cleaners. The security guards. The receptionists. The drivers. People hear things when powerful people think nobody is listening. Richard sat quietly. The truth was, he had spent years focusing only on executives and senior managers. He barely knew the names of the people working behind the scenes. Emma stood and picked up her coffee pot. Rich people spend too much time looking up. Richard smiled. And where should I look? Emma shrugged. Try looking around. For the second time, she had given him an answer that sounded simple, but somehow felt important. As Richard left the diner that night, he already knew what his next step would be. He was going to start talking to the people everyone else ignored. The next morning, Richard did something he had never done before. Instead of meeting executives, he started talking to ordinary employees. He spoke with receptionists, drivers, maintenance workers, security guards, people who rarely received attention from senior management. Most had little information, but one security guard remembered something unusual. A temporary access badge had been used near Richard's office on the same day one of the suspicious approvals was signed. Another employee recalled seeing Daniel Cross meeting someone late at night in the parking garage. Then Richard's longtime driver shared something unexpected. Mr. Cross used to ask me to drop him off around the corner instead of at the main entrance. The driver said, Why? He said he didn't want anyone seeing who he was meeting. Richard felt his stomach tighten. The pieces were beginning to connect. Later that afternoon, Grace reviewed additional records. More suspicious transactions appeared. More missing approvals. More unexplained transfers. None of it looked accidental. Someone had spent months building a trap, and all signs pointed toward Daniel. The realization hurt more than Richard expected. Daniel wasn't just a business partner. He had been one of Richard's closest friends for 20 years. They had built the company together. Richard trusted him completely. Now that trust looked like the very thing that had been used against him. That evening, Richard returned to Miller's Diner. Emma was wiping tables when he arrived. You found something, she said immediately. Richard nodded. I think my friend betrayed me. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, Sometimes the people closest to us can hurt us the most. Richard looked away. For the first time since the scandal began, he stopped wondering whether he had been ruined. Instead, he started asking a different question. Why had Daniel done it? And the answer, he knew, was getting closer. The next morning, Richard did something he had never done before. Instead of meeting executives, he started talking to ordinary employees. He spoke with receptionists, drivers, maintenance workers, security guards, people who rarely received attention from senior management. Most had little information, but one security guard remembered something unusual. A temporary access badge had been used near Richard's office on the same day one of the suspicious approvals was signed. Another employee recalled seeing Daniel Cross meeting someone late at night in the parking garage. Then Richard's longtime driver shared something unexpected. Mr. Cross used to ask me to drop him off around the corner instead of at the main entrance, the driver said. Why? He said he didn't want anyone seeing who he was meeting. Richard felt his stomach tighten. The pieces were beginning to connect. Later that afternoon, Grace reviewed additional records. More suspicious transactions appeared. More missing approvals. More unexplained transfers. None of it looked accidental. Someone had spent months building a trap, and all signs pointed toward Daniel. The realization hurt more than Richard expected. Daniel wasn't just a business partner. He had been one of Richard's closest friends for 20 years. They had built the company together. Richard trusted him completely. Now that trust looked like the very thing that had been used against him. That evening, Richard returned to Miller's Diner. Emma was wiping tables when he arrived. You found something, she said immediately. Richard nodded. I think my friend betrayed me. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, sometimes the people closest to us can hurt us the most. Richard looked away. For the first time since the scandal began, he stopped wondering whether he had been ruined. Instead, he started asking a different question. Why had Daniel done it? And the answer, he knew, was getting closer. Scene 6. For the next few days, Richard's life became a cycle of meetings, investigations, and unanswered questions. Every morning began with stacks of documents. Every afternoon brought new discoveries. And every evening seemed to end at Miller's Diner. The strange thing was that Richard had started looking forward to those evenings. Not because of the coffee. The coffee was good, but that wasn't the reason. It was because the diner felt real. Nobody there cared about stock prices, board votes, or media headlines. People talked about rent, family, school, work, and getting through another week. For years, Richard had surrounded himself with people who spoke in numbers. At Miller's Diner, people spoke in realities. One evening, he arrived to find Emma sitting alone at the counter, with a textbook open in front of her. She was highlighting sections while eating a small plate of fries. Richard took his usual seat. Emma looked up and smiled. You look tired. I am tired. You should sleep. I'll add that to my schedule. Emma laughed. You always joke when you're stressed. Occupational hazard. She closed her textbook and joined him at the booth. For the first time, Richard noticed how exhausted she looked. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked as though she hadn't slept properly in days. You should take your own advice, he said. Emma smiled. I don't have billionaire problems. No. She shook her head. I have normal people problems. Richard leaned back. And what exactly are normal people problems? Emma looked down at her hands. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether to answer. Then she sighed. Rent. Tuition. Food. Transportation. Try not to panic every time something unexpected happens. Richard listened quietly. Emma rarely talked about herself. She was always asking questions instead. My mother passed away when I was 16, she continued. After that, everything became my responsibility. I work here during the day. I take classes at night. And every month I try to figure out how to make everything fit together. Richard was silent. The truth was that he hadn't worried about paying rent in decades. The amount of money that kept Emma awake at night was probably less than he spent entertaining clients in a single evening. Yet, somehow she seemed stronger than many people he knew. Do you ever think about quitting? Richard asked. Emma laughed softly. Every week. Then why don't you? She thought for a moment. Because quitting doesn't solve anything. The answer was so simple that it almost irritated him. Yet the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Richard had spent weeks wanting to escape. Escape the scandal. Escape the headlines. Escape the shame. But none of those things would disappear simply because he stopped fighting. At that moment, Emma's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. The smile immediately disappeared from her face. Richard noticed. What happened? Nothing. It doesn't look like nothing. Emma hesitated. Then she showed him the screen. It was an email from her college. Final notice. Outstanding tuition balance. Registration may be suspended. Richard felt a knot form in his stomach. The amount wasn't enormous. To him, it looked insignificant. To Emma, it clearly felt overwhelming. Without thinking, he said, "How much do you need?" Emma's expression changed instantly. Not angry, not offended, just firm. "No." Richard blinked. "I was only trying to help." "I know." "Then why no?" Emma folded the phone and placed it back in her pocket. "Because I didn't tell you so you could solve it." Richard sat quietly. She continued. "People see someone struggling and immediately assume the answer is money. Sometimes the answer is respect." The words hit him harder than he expected. Emma wasn't refusing help because she was proud. She was refusing because she wanted to be seen as capable, not as a problem to be fixed. Richard nodded slowly. "I understand." Emma smiled. "No, you don't." For a second, he looked surprised. Then they both laughed. "Fair enough," he admitted. Outside, the rain had started again. Cars moved slowly through the wet streets. Inside the diner, life continued as normal. Customers ordered food. Dishes clattered in the kitchen. Frank Miller shouted at a delivery driver about tomatoes. Everything felt ordinary. And somehow that ordinary world was teaching Richard more than any boardroom ever had. As he prepared to leave, Emma stopped him. "Mr. Hawthorne?" "Yes." "Did you find out why Daniel did it?" Richard looked down. "No, but I'm getting closer." Emma nodded. "Then keep going. What if I don't like what I find?" She smiled. "Truth doesn't care whether we like it." Richard stood there for a moment. Then he laughed softly. Every conversation with Emma seemed to end with a lesson, and every lesson seemed to push him one step closer to becoming someone different from the man who first walked into that diner. As he left that night, he realized something important. For the first time since the scandal began, he wasn't fighting just to save his company. He was fighting to uncover the truth, and that made all the difference. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. By 6 a.m., business websites were publishing updates. By 8 a.m., financial news channels were discussing the investigation. And by lunchtime, the story was everywhere. For weeks, the public had believed one thing. Richard Hawthorne was the man responsible for the scandal. Now, investigators were saying something very different. Evidence recovered from the storage facility had revealed forged approvals, hidden shell companies, suspicious transfers, and records connecting Daniel Cross to a long-running fraud scheme. The headlines changed almost overnight. New evidence points away from Billionaire CEO. Former CFO linked to financial fraud investigation. Questions raised about Daniel Cross's role in Whitmore scandal. Richard sat in Grace Sullivan's office watching the coverage unfold. The television mounted on the wall showed analysts discussing the latest developments. One expert explained how the evidence appeared to show a deliberate effort to use Richard's name and authority to hide fraudulent activities. Another questioned how Daniel had managed to operate for so long without being detected. Richard listened quietly. A week earlier, hearing his name on television made him feel sick. Now he felt something else. Relief. Not because everything had been fixed. Far from it. The investigation was still ongoing. His reputation was still damaged. His company was still facing enormous challenges. But at least the truth had finally started fighting back. Grace switched off the television. The room suddenly became quiet. "You know what the strange part is?" Richard said. "What?" "I should feel happy." Grace leaned back in her chair. "But you don't." Richard shook his head. "No." He walked toward the window. Traffic moved slowly below. People hurried along the sidewalks. Life continued as though none of this had happened. I spent weeks blaming myself, Richard said. I thought maybe I had failed somehow. Grace didn't interrupt. I trusted Daniel completely. More than anyone. I signed documents without checking them because I trusted him. I defended him when other people questioned him. And now I keep asking myself how I missed all of this. Grace finally spoke. Because he earned your trust. Richard looked at her. That's not the same as being foolish. The word stayed with him. For the first time, Richard realized something important. Being betrayed did not automatically make someone weak. Sometimes it simply meant they had trusted the wrong person. And that was a painful lesson, not a shameful one. Just then, Richard's phone started ringing. Then it rang again, and again. The first call came from a board member. The second came from one of the company's largest investors. The third came from a bank executive who had refused to return his calls only days earlier. Richard looked at the screen and laughed. Grace raised an eyebrow. What? They've all suddenly remembered my phone number. Grace smiled. Funny how that works. Over the next few hours, Richard spoke with people who had practically abandoned him. Some offered support. Others offered apologies. A few acted as though they had believed in him all along. Those conversations taught Richard something else. Success attracts people. Failure reveals them. By late afternoon, Richard attended an emergency board meeting. The atmosphere was completely different from the previous meeting. The same people who had discussed removing him now welcomed him warmly. The same people who questioned his leadership now spoke about unity and stability. Richard listened. But this time he heard something beneath the words. Fear. The board members were worried. Not about him. About themselves. Several of them had ignored warning signs. Several had approved recommendations without asking questions. And now, they were worried about how history would remember them. When the meeting opened for discussion, Richard stood. The room immediately fell silent. For a moment, he simply looked around the table. Some faces showed guilt. Others showed discomfort. A few avoided eye contact completely. Then Richard spoke. I've spent a lot of time thinking these past few weeks. Nobody interrupted. I've thought about this company, our employees, our investors, our communities, and I've realized something. He paused. We became very good at looking at numbers. Several board members exchanged nervous glances. We tracked profits, growth, acquisitions, expansion. But somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing people. The room grew quieter. Richard thought about Miller's Diner, about Frank Miller, about Emma, about the security guards and maintenance workers who had provided some of the most valuable information during the investigation. People the company rarely noticed. Yet those same people had helped uncover the truth. The biggest mistake we made wasn't financial, Richard continued. It was believing important information only comes from important people. Nobody spoke, because everybody knew he was right. Richard continued. Effective immediately, all pending residential acquisition projects are suspended pending review. Several board members looked shocked. One immediately raised a hand. Richard, those projects represent millions in projected revenue. Richard looked directly at him. And the neighborhoods affected represent thousands of lives. The room fell silent again. No one challenged him, not because they agreed, but because they understood the moment. The old Richard Hawthorne might have cared only about growth. This Richard cared about consequences. The meeting ended shortly afterward. As Richard walked out, Grace caught up with him. That was a very different speech. Richard smiled. It was, "You've changed." For a moment he thought about Emma, about the rainy night at the diner, about the cold coffee, about the simple advice that had started all of this. Maybe she was right. Maybe the story wasn't about saving a company. Maybe it was about becoming the person he should have been years ago. That evening, Richard returned to Miller's Diner. The bell above the door rang as he entered. Emma was carrying a tray of food to a customer. When she spotted him, she smiled. "You're late." Richard sat down. "You noticed. You come here enough now." A few minutes later she brought him coffee. The same black coffee he still claimed was terrible. "So," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "What happened?" Richard told her everything. The media coverage, the board meeting, the suspended projects, the reactions, the apologies, the awkward conversations. Emma listened quietly. When he finished, she smiled. "Sounds like you're finally learning." "Learning what?" "That companies are made of people." Richard laughed softly. "You always make everything sound simple." Emma shrugged. Simple doesn't mean easy. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard looked around the diner, the customers, the staff, the ordinary lives happening all around him. A month ago, he probably wouldn't have noticed any of it. Now it felt impossible not to. And as he sipped his coffee, Richard realized something. The investigation had saved his reputation. But the people in this diner had saved something far more important: his perspective. Over the following months, the investigation continued. Daniel Cross was formally charged. More evidence surfaced. Former associates began cooperating with authorities. And little by little, the truth came into full view. What investigators uncovered shocked even Richard. Daniel had spent nearly 2 years building a network of shell companies, fake contracts, and hidden accounts. He had carefully used Richard's trust as a shield, assuming nobody would ever question documents carrying the billionaire's name and signature. But eventually, every lie ran out of places to hide. The criminal case moved forward. Several properties connected to the scheme were frozen. Millions of dollars were recovered, and Whitmore Development slowly began rebuilding its reputation. For Richard, however, the biggest changes weren't happening inside boardrooms. They were happening inside him. One evening, he sat in Miller's diner, watching Emma finish her shift. The dinner rush had ended. Most of the customers had gone home. Frank Miller was counting receipts behind the counter, while pretending not to listen to everyone else's conversations. Emma finally dropped into the seat across from Richard and sighed. "I'm exhausted." "You say that every time I see you." "Because I'm exhausted every time you see me." Richard laughed. Then he noticed her backpack sitting beside the booth. Several textbooks were sticking out. One of them looked badly worn. "How's school?" Emma smiled. "Still expensive." Richard nodded. For months he had wanted to help her, not because he felt sorry for her, but because he genuinely believed in her. The problem was that every time he tried, she reminded him that help without respect wasn't really help. And she was right. That lesson had stayed with him. In fact, it had changed the way he approached many things. The next morning, Richard met with Grace. "I need your help." Grace looked suspicious immediately. "Those words usually cost me time and money." Richard smiled. "This one will cost me both." He explained his idea. Not a gift, not a personal payment, not a favor. A scholarship program. One designed specifically for hard-working students who were balancing school, jobs, family responsibilities, and financial hardship. Students like Emma. But not only Emma, many others. Grace listened carefully. When he finished, she leaned back. "That's actually a good idea." "Thank you. I didn't say it was easy." Over the next several weeks, they worked on the details. The program would be administered independently. Applications would be reviewed by a committee. Recipients would be selected based on clear criteria. No special treatment. No publicity requirements. No personal obligations. Everything would be transparent. Everything would be fair. Finally, Richard brought the completed proposal to Miller's diner. Emma immediately became suspicious when she saw the folder. "No," Richard laughed. "You haven't even opened it." "I know that look." "What look?" "The rich person with the folder look." Frank nearly dropped the plate laughing. Richard pushed the folder toward her. "Just read it." Emma reluctantly opened it. The further she read, the quieter she became. Frank stopped pretending not to watch. Richard sat patiently. Finally, Emma looked up. "You created this?" Richard nodded. "Why?" The answer came easily. "Because talent shouldn't disappear because of money." Emma stared at him. Then she continued reading. The scholarship wasn't named after Richard. It wasn't about publicity. It wasn't designed to make anyone grateful. It was designed to create opportunity. And that made all the difference. After nearly 20 minutes of questions, Emma closed the folder. I still don't know. Richard smiled. You don't have to decide today. A week later, she gave her answer. Yes, not because she wanted charity, not because she needed rescuing, but because she believed the program could help people like her, people who worked hard but constantly found themselves one bill away from losing opportunities. When the first scholarship awards were announced, Emma became one of the recipients. Her tuition hold disappeared. Her books were covered. And for the first time in years, she could focus on school without constantly worrying about whether she could afford to stay enrolled. The day she received confirmation from the college, she sat alone in the diner kitchen staring at the email. She read it once, then twice, then a third time. Frank eventually found her sitting there. You okay? Emma nodded, then immediately started crying. Not dramatic tears, not loud tears, just the kind that appear when someone has been carrying a heavy burden for too long. Frank sat beside her. Good news? Emma laughed through the tears. The best. Frank smiled. I thought so. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Emma looked down at the email again. All those years of working, studying, sacrificing, refusing to quit. It suddenly felt worth it. That evening, Richard arrived at the diner, as usual. Emma met him at the door. You got the email? Richard smiled immediately. I did. For a second, neither spoke. Then Emma hugged him. Only briefly. Only because words weren't enough. When she stepped back, her eyes were shining. Thank you. Richard shook his head. No. Emma frowned. No. You earned this. For a moment, she looked like she might argue. Then she smiled, because deep down, she knew he was right. The scholarship had opened a door, but she was the one who had spent years walking toward it. And now, for the first time, her future felt closer than ever. A future that no longer felt controlled by fear. A future she had fought for. A future she had earned.